Hi, everybody. Thanks for eavesdropping. Tantramat here. I want to start today's, I got to find a word for it. I don't know a word, but I like the analogy of we're sitting around a table having tea or whatever we're drinking or not, and that you're listening in the window. So I don't know, maybe we don't even have a human word. Or maybe we've lost the significance or the preciousness of what it is to just sit around and engage in thoughts that we've been thinking and things we've been observing and things we've been paying attention to. And how Create a World started, for those of you that this is your first time. And I got some lovely emails, so I know it is some of your first times. It's really impossible for those of us that are really paying attention to things. We have to take a moment to form it into a book or form it into a seminar or form it into a document that then give to humanity to see if it will serve them. But that's actually not how life happens. Life happens on a moment-to-moment basis, and something's unfolding way beyond what human beings, I think, are prepared for. But also, we're in a very fast renaissance. That means that our thoughts and our perceptions and our ways of existing are still based in our thought processes in the past, even our point of view about what we are. And yet, when you're in a renaissance, all that starts to change. All that starts to have a different, what I call the next recursion of perception, the next recursion of wholeness in my world. And so Heather and Daniela particularly, but then recently Daniela and I and Heather, all in our own format and beyond, we've been paying attention to something, and it's not like we're going to make it the new truth or make it the next thing you have to believe. But there is something remarkable about human thinking, which is really how I want to set up today. And the remarkable thing about human thinking is human beings are actually designed to think. And when we're in conversation, or when we're eavesdropping, or when we're watching a video, or when we're obsessive about a particular YouTube channel, or we're listening to one strain of thinking for a long time, that becomes our reality. Who knows what reality is? But what we learn to think does influence reality and does give us the lens or the perception within which reality occurs. And it would look like we have two camps going on right now. I'm not sure that's true. I think there's going to be a middle camp, because that's what happens in what's called a singularity. Everything moves to the next greater whole, and then everything reforms into kind of a new synthesization of experience and perception and even reality. So my query to Dr. Heather Hunt, DC, in the black and white, and Daniela di Piero, did I pronounce it right?
Di Piero or Di
Di
Piero.
Piero. A little of my French that I didn't through, or Italian. And is that they didn't know what I was going to ask them or what my inquiry was this morning. But now I'm going to let you know. It's this thing about ologies. And what I've been struggling with, and why I want to do all these conversations related somewhat to the limbic system, but not quite. It's really a whole system conversation. Is that we have psychology, we have neurology, we have naturopathy, we have homeopathy, we have psychology, we have mysticism, who's an ism, not an ology, but then we have spirituality, which is ality, not an ology. But everything in the human system has been broken up into pieces, and the pieces don't know how to come back together. They don't know how to give human beings thinking. And what's happened to humanity is we can only think in one box. And if we try to think outside that box, by the way our brain is designed to function, it has to make the other box wrong. And so we're in a mess, I mean, to say it mildly. And So today I want to say from a mystical point of view, because that's the realm I live in. I did this great recording. Someone called me when I was walking the dog, and I recorded him because I didn't want to miss it. And he was talking about how lonely he felt and crazy he felt growing up because the only world he was allowed to live in was the empirical one, the one that had been proved by set standards of proof. And so his human experience, real not matching that, almost drove him nuts. And so I'll be using that in something I do so that he can contribute to us, the people. But the thing I want to say, I'm going to start with a mystical point of view of what's happening now. And then I'd like Daniela and Heather for you all to speak from your point of view. We're not going to box it, okay? Because we all color outside the lines as well as inside the lines. But for me, as a mystic, when I was born, I felt like my brain was being shredded, and that ever what I came in with was being torn apart. And I had a real psychological event with that. I split into many points of view. And if I hadn't had the psychologist that I had, I think I would have been a psych ward for quite a few years. And he was the one that said, your diagnosis is a multiple personality with no central self. But he said, I think you're just never lost your multidimensional sense of self. He said, I think that's what really happened. And then he said, why don't I show you how to live with you? And he did. He showed me how to live with me. And so I now, when I started consults or whatever you want to call them, engagements, when I was 19, there were two things I was paying attention to. One thing I was paying attention to was I was going, which I now know is the ENS, the enteric nervous system. I was going back to the little thing, the little tube before it formed the embryo. And this is what I mean by this conversation. Like I got those two linked up, like they made sense. They made sense in the matter. And of course, Ayurvedic medicine deals with the enteric nervous system as the seat of the soul. So I knew in the empirical or the objective world that I had always been reading what I call the core, but it had something to do with the memory of the human being of themselves before they had history here. Mm-hmm. So that was between the empirical knowledge and my mystical awareness, something went ka-chunk. And then I began to notice that there were parts of the human system coming online, and Heather and I certainly experienced that in 2016, and that this solar plexus and this aspect of the body, when I would start to go into, I guess I'd call repair it or give it a place, I prefer, it seemed to carry a sense of self. And then I realized in the martial arts, and gurus and who practice meditation, they literally have to calm the fire in the belly, the solar plexus, to literally feel the self. So all these bits and pieces have been coming together for me in a coalescing wholeness, is how I would say, in my thinking. And then so today, and we're kind of starting a thread for the month and a half. About let's just see how much we can get how we relate to things, coalescing in a way that give human beings a way to think of their system as a wholeness, not as all these fragmented parts, and just see what comes up. And of course, the most recent one was for me when I went to get the vaccine. I mean, I wasn't going to get the vaccine. And then I just felt my entire limbic system almost say, good to go. You will not be harmed. And I registered the limbic system in a way I'd never registered it before. And somebody asked me, well, what's the limbic system? And my response was, look it up in Google. Because, well, let's just use that as a springboard, because I'm not sure we really know what the limbic system is at all. So, and then the last thing I want to share is Heather said something yesterday which seemed innocuous at the time. I mean, just a statement. but it stayed with me. And that is that I never in my whole life registered the power of the Lord upon me would be one of the ways you would experience it, or in my case, the power of the force coming into me. And then all the movies about when the magician uses all the power of her force or his force, she's very, very weak afterwards. And she was talking to me about my beta blocker just to keep my blood safe while my heart heals. And she said, she referred to as a cortisol response. And yet then I registered Monday. What happened to me was I was clear I was in a severe cortisol response. And then I had said to her, I think your solar plexus is just coming online, when she was in her cortisol spikes. And you understand, then all this weaving began to happen. And I had an objective way to monitor, not my surges, because the surges still happen, and they happen emotionally as well as kind of energetically, but to literally have a way to monitor something in my body so that I could be in the universe as a powerful, creative human being, not only expressing life, but operating on behalf of life. That was a long dissertation, but the point was to lay it out for other calls that will be in for the rest of the month. And so I'm going to let you all introduce yourselves. I don't introduce people, and I never have and never will. And because each of us has our own relationship with ourselves. So Daniela, since you're new on the screen, if you will introduce yourself ever how you want to and anything you want to say. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here. And hi, everyone. So yes, my name's Daniela, and I'm a mom. I have two wonderful rascally boys, and I'm a therapist, which is my kind of professional ology. And what else about me? I'm a horse person. I work with horses a lot, and I love making things with my hands. It's kind of one of the main things that grounds me in this world. And yeah, I can pause there. And then Heather, did you want to say anything to begin, or should I
go for it?
Dive in with, so there's so much that you were just speaking to that, I wish the same thing you're talking about with the body and the brain. I wish we could do that with conversation, where we have this like 3D conversation that's somehow multidimensional all at once, which our language doesn't really allow in English. And I mean, I've spoken Spanish, but I haven't spoken any indigenous languages, where my understanding is that in a lot of language bases, there is a multivalent way to speak and communicate, because when you're speaking certain words, they have different meanings at the same time. So when you're stringing a whole bunch of those words together, there's a feeling of kind of, well, again, I can barely even describe it because I'm in a Western brain, having only mainly used English. But my sense of it is that it allows for this kind of breathing into a huger story in what we're speaking and how we're understanding each other. And one of the things you were saying, somebody you had spoken with yesterday used that word loneliness, and it really stuck with me because, I mean, so many of us are lonely, I think, aren't we? I mean, I know I have been most of my life, even with the great blessing of close people and relationships. But at some deep level, it seems like we really are craving something that we've known before, which is this interconnected way of being, so that there is some uniqueness that we each carry, of course. So I'm interested in how this conversation helps us along in that, both at an individual level with our friends and families, or on calls like this, and at a communal level, and then also at a human species level. And so I'd say that's maybe some of where my interest in this one particular ology of psychology has come from, is mainly that. How do we sit with each other deeply in relationship? perhaps in deep pain, sorrow, this word trauma that comes up so often now, joy, grief. How do we sit with each other and be with each other in these spaces in a way that then allows movement, transformation, co-regulation toward more and more whole ways of being? So that's just the little, the thoughts that I have listening to you right now in the beginning. And there's so much more we can say about the limbic system and all that, but yeah. I think you're muted.
One of the things that was very notable when we, in the Language of Consciousness Institute, we have with these things called creation templates, they got translated into Spanish. The interesting thing is how we say in English, craving being or observing being. In Spanish, there's actually a word for it. And while in the English, and there are three kinds of being in the Spanish language. And one of them actually represents what's meant by the way the craving templates are written. But in English, people struggle with the word being because they don't have the distinctions that the Spanish have. So the Spanish take to them like fish to water because it's inside their language. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is that I love the most important thing you said to me, or with me listening, is that how do we merge minds? How do not just the three of us on this call, but the minds that are listening? And how do they merge just by their listening? How do you do that? And I set up propositions. I think that's the right word. And then I see if they play out. I see if they evidence themselves. And one of the things I noticed in these activations, doing these limbic activations, is like this. It's almost such a simple aha that I feel embarrassed. I mean, like it seems way too simple. But I noticed when I was trying to stimulate the brain that if I gave it a story that it didn't go ape over, if I gave it a story that made it calm and made it seem reasonable and made it fit, because I'm a cellular empath, and then if I then began to create an imaginative process, like two little sentinels called amygdalae standing at the gate, and there's some kind of guardian at the midbrain, like imaginative things, I literally watched the two hemispheres even out. I mean, they just evened out. And I thought, wow. I mean, this is where my sense of being stupid came in, or my feel of stupid. I was like, wow, it's right there all the time. We just, they cut imagination out of education. You have to buy the company line. You have to believe what the world tells you is real. And you don't trust your own sense making. And you don't trust your own imaginative process because it doesn't fit in an empirical manner. But then to see, because that's how I do it, to see the evidence of the brain calming because it was getting food. It was getting a story that it could live with, literally live with, not to go hyperactive. And it was receiving the imaginative process. So the imaginative process could balance the rational process. And it flabbergasted me. I mean, I'm still flabbergasted, obviously. And I thought that was incredible. And I just felt my brain do something in my head when I said that. And I thought, wow, maybe it's time for humanity to trust their sense of things, maybe, and to not toss it just because it doesn't fit in something that's been objectified, and to enjoy their imagination, even if it has nothing to do with their survival or seems to have nothing to do with this constant need to survive, which I think is real or imagined, which I think, of course, is the source of all trauma for me. Over to you.
Yeah, because with imagination, I mean, they've done all these studies, right? Even watching what happens in the brain with Olympic athletes and so on. If we imagine an activity, we imagine into something, it actually creates so many of the same responses neurologically and in the brain as it would if we were actually going through that motion, if we were actually taking the high jump or whatever. And what if imagination could be this tool for, I mean, I see it when working with clients all the time, the power of imagery. And there's a whole, I mean, I was trained in imaginal psychology, which is this whole field of how you enter the imaginal realm, and through guided imagery, visualization, so on and so forth, create total transformation in the brain. And when I talk about the brain, I'm also talking about, I mean, we mean the brain, the heart, the gut, because our neurological system, our neurons are mainly, I think, as I understand it, in those three places, but that there are these interconnected networks. I was thinking about this last night because my son, who Heather worked on actually when he was a day old, maybe even like newborn, my oldest son, who's now 9. And he's very finely tuned neurologically, and so can dysregulate really easily, but it's because he's taking in a ton of information. And I remember as a baby, he would always have a hard time sleeping. And I remember one time just realizing, oh, I can help hold a protective field around him through certain imagery that came to me, probably came from him to me, whatever, who knows who started it, but together calling in this imagery of protection around him and guardianship and a circle basically around him. And I swear, as soon as I would remember to do that, sometimes it took me like 2 hours of trying to nurse him down before I would remember to just have that image. And the second I had the image, the second I began to imagine it, within 30 seconds to 60 seconds, he would be asleep. And I was talking, the reason I'm thinking about it is because he's been sick this week. And so last night he was asking for it, and I was remembering to do that for him again. And so it's this thing that throughout these 9 years, that I feel like that's a description of co-regulation. We use this word co-regulation with mirror neurons and how our bodies and minds and brains ping off each other and change each other and come into a balanced state with each other. Of course, it can work in the other direction too, or we can spin each other out more and more into the amygdala, fear, fight, flight responses, which often happens between me and my son too. But in this case, how can we bring that into the human field more and more and more? And when I imagine, and Heather, this goes to your empathic human design stuff, I think when one of us does that, it's automatically helping and informing other people around us, even if we're not engaging in a verbal conversation about it. So that's what that makes me think of when, yeah.
Heather?
Okay. I'm Heather Hunt. I'm a chiropractor and cranial sacral therapist. Danielle and I are both in Nevada City, California. I jot notes. So just listening kind of back from the beginning of this call, the notes I have is that the body carries this sense of self and it knows it's whole. Underneath it knows it's whole. And I think that's where, Daniela, when you were speaking of the loneliness, is that, and the kind of the despair and the negative, kind of the difficult empathic responses and the difficulties we have living in the world, are that we remember this wholeness, and we weren't born into, a kind of a reality in the Western world that nurtures wholeness and that nurtures our empathic designs. And so after we kind of have lost that as children, we receive these, like Tantra used the word surges, that come through the solar plexus or that fight or flight system, the limbic system. And it can put us into panic or anxiety or depression, sadness, loneliness, all these emotions come up. And the investigation we've been in is how do we understand those surges? How do we understand those frequencies coming in and give them a place and help our bodies? And I think what I'm really hearing so far in this conversation is using those in imaginative realms, remembering Danielle and I both went to Waldorf school. It's not the same one, but we have that training. And Waldorf education is one of the few that I don't know of any other actually that really nourishes the imagination. And so we were both gifted with kind of having that. I don't know how I went through 8th grade. I'm not sure, Daniela, is that you too? Yeah. So just to be like in an environment that really nourished our imaginations, but then again, that kind of gets crushed out of us. And it came back for me online after having children and also after working with you, Tantra, where it's like, let's just be silly. Let's just imagine things. And so now I have all sorts of fun imaginations. Like when people are on the table, when I feel, their shoulder blades activating, I think, oh, is this their wings coming back? Or, like, it's just fun to be in that more playful space. And it takes so much pressure off. And I love Daniela's description around her son, because we are creating those realities all the time. And so how do we help them be playful? And, I think we get so caught in this sort of trauma-based world. And then right now there's so much languaging around trauma, which is absolutely important and true. And that we are working through that collectively. And we're working through trauma collectively, and we're working through collective trauma. But how do we do that in a way that we don't get mired down, and that we stay in this fun remembrance of wholeness and the embodiment of that, and also in our imaginations? And I'd be really curious, Daniela, I'm really curious more about your practice and therapy, and like how you're paying attention to these things with clients and what you're noticing is up with people, because I feel like things definitely come up in surges, not only in our own bodies, but I notice it with my patients all the time and myself.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I would say what I'm noticing in myself and with clients I'm working with is it almost feels like maybe almost like a trauma dam or something, where there's so much powerful bottled up energy that has gotten stuck in different parts of the body, different parts of the nervous system, because of not just individual trauma from childhood or from birth or from pre-verbal experiences that we don't even story or have a story attached to. Most of us, Tantra, you probably do. But many of us don't have stories attached to, say, pre-6 months, even sometimes pre-2 years, because we don't have the language to describe it. But that doesn't mean we don't have absolute visceral memory of everything from conception, in utero, birth process, so on and so forth. And trauma doesn't have to be bad necessarily. It depends on how we're using the word, but I use trauma pretty liberally to talk about any experience that has created some sort of scare or dysregulation in the body, in the brain, in the nervous system, such that there's a freeze, dissociation. There is a fleeing or a fighting, but often in the earlier stages, it seems to be more freeze. In what I'm watching with people's nervous systems. So not only individual trauma from childhood or whenever, but then also, like you're talking about, how there are collective trauma, current trauma, current traumas that are happening on a collective or societal level that we're all living through. Historical trauma, of course, intergenerational trauma, epigenetics, ways that we're able to even track now how DNA can turn on and off. Certain genes can turn on and off in response to kind of things that have happened in the genetic line. But even that, I think, only can explain a really, really small percentage of the amount of collective memory that we carry. And so when we talk about trauma healing, it's like one thing if we're like, okay, I was in a car accident and I'm going to just go in and I'm going to take care of what that jostled or froze in my nervous system. But often if we're going in to try to clear one particular thing, it ends up being attached to many, many, many other things. And if we go deep enough, at least in my own explorations with this now, I kind of feel like there's no end to it, really. There's just an ever expanding, ever enlivening quest and exploration and play in terms of healing and kind of recapacitation of the human being. Because, you know, if we handle the individual level and then we go into the collective and then we go into the historical, and eventually, you know, we're working with ancestral trauma and so on and so forth, which we all carry, of course. There's racialized trauma that people are living with every day, and that also carries very, very intense historical trauma along with it. So it's no small task, but I think it's so neat that we're talking about imagination and play and creativity, because I think you're right, Heather. If we don't have that, if we don't have song and dance and the things that have kind of, or art or whatever it is, music, that have created this upwelling of resilience in the human soul over and over and over again, if we don't have that, then the exhaustion gets really deep. But I will say that I also, even if I come in to say I'm exhausted myself or whatever has been happening, feeling a little deadened by screens or the kind of more boxed in nature of our work roles that can happen sometimes in this profession. As soon as I come into interbeing with somebody in a field where we're doing trauma work, even if I'm tired, I'm like, oh, I don't really think I want to do trauma work today. I don't really think I want to be in this collective holding of space around trauma. It's just a silly thought that comes through, because really when it's happening, the joy and release, and joy might even be the wrong word. It's like the catharsis of any healer knows what I'm talking about. It's like there's so much available goodness and release that happens even when it's the hardest, even when there's a ton of pain that's coming through. I'll stop talking in a second, but specifically, Heather, to answer your question, one of your questions, the main thing I do in my practice now is called brain spotting. And so it grew out of EMDR. A lot of people have heard of EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, very long kind of wordy name. But basically, to pare it down, what brain spotting is it's a way to help the body and brain unlock how trauma got stored and frozen or encapsulated and let it out. And so that looks different ways for different people. It uses bilateral stimulation because for whatever reason, that seems to really help crossing the corpus callosum of the brain. So crossing the midline, EMDR does it by eyes moving back and forth. Brain spotting does it through bilateral music that gently goes from one ear to the other ear. And then also using eye gaze spots, because the eye position has been found to be incredibly powerful when unlocking trauma systems. And again, you know, all of this is such exploration territory. Nobody really understands how this works. Tantra, you probably know more about why it works and how it works than, you know, all the EMDR and brain spotting practitioners. But when you were talking about the early brainstem, you know, the eyes, as my understanding, get formed very early on in our human embodiment process. And so all those tiny little muscles that connect our eyes and move them around are directly, you know, coming from that brainstem development. And so it's very old in our physicalized system, that our eyes move and do things in sync with how we're feeling, or in sync with what our nervous system is doing. So with brain spotting, we can help find an eye gaze spot where either the trauma capsule is, you know, where it's like, oh, it feels really, really, really bad over there when I look right there. And then the system starts processing in whatever way it does, and it comes out. We can also find resourcing spots, which really helps because that taps into this you know, imaginative, creative power that we're talking about. And that can really help support and augment the system to be able to release the trauma. So when trauma releases, often it looks like shaking, you know, that's happens in a lot of other trauma healing modalities with craniosacral and somatic experiencing and psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So often there's like tremors of different kinds. But sometimes it's also very, very still. And And what I love about the spirit of brain spotting, and I'm imagining all these other modalities too. I haven't trained in all of them, but the whole idea is the practitioner doesn't know anything. Like, we are just holding an opening space and following. We have some of these tools, but then we're following the person who's healing, because it's their body and their brain and their soul that knows how to heal themselves. And it really helps to do it in concert with another human, even if it's through a screen. It's kind of amazing that it actually works when our bodies aren't in physical presence with each other, but it can work really amazingly online as well. So I'll pause there.
Just a couple of things I'd like to add. You know, the missing element is the water we're swimming in.
Yeah.
So we have a huge person-to-person centricity. But what's changing is the water we're swimming in. We've had more people seek consciousness in our modern days. I'm 76 this month. I think I'm maybe 76. I'm one of those 2 years. I can't remember. And so I came from where consciousness wasn't even a thought. Believing in God was as close as you got, into the European spiritualist. And my Fanny, my mom, I can't remember what she was called, but my mammy, she belonged to an occult Black church. So this little 5-year-old would go to church and jump the broom and sometimes dance with snakes, like on the ground. And because in that tradition, it was remembering that they didn't belong to human beings and what human beings did to them. They belonged to creation, to the snakes and the air and the ethers, we would call it in modern spirituality. So that was my upbringing. I was crippled with polio when I was, I think, 3 years old. I think that's right. And I had a faith healing when I was 11. And my limbs straightened out. And I could ride a bike by the time I was 21. So very little of this came from belief. A lot of this came from living something with other beings that lived it as a natural norm. What I began to notice was there was a difference in the very air they breathed, the way they breathed their air. It wasn't just air. And of course, in Hindu, that started to be introduced to the modern world, I think it would have been in my teens, Hinduism and meditation and gurus, that air was called prana. But I never heard of prana when I kept saying, Fanny, you breathe a different kind of air than us, my whiteness. You breathe a different kind of air. And so when all these different beliefs started coming in, it's why I'm not high on belief. They gave us a way for the brain to attach the thought process, to attach to the belief, but it didn't give a direct experience of what was the person was present to. It didn't change the air. And you and Heather and others I have on Create a World, you breathe a different kind of air. You just do. You know, I can say in my book, Language of Creation, I talk about realities that generate separation, structures of consciousness that literally separate us from ourselves, others in life, and other structures of consciousness, which we call indigenous people sometimes. But look what's happened to them. Having to swim in a reality of separation, they're alcoholics. They got given to families to be raised. And the ultimate trauma I have discovered is separation from the original nature of ourself. And it all this is peeling down. And I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to read something, Daniela, before you answer it, and also Heather. And that is, as we are in a trauma-based planet, a tree can fall on us and kill us. But our system isn't organized to track that, only when needed. our system is actually organized to have fun and enjoy life. I mean, look at this place: birds, trees, air, seasons. And our system is more relegated to that than it's relegated to tracking trauma. And the very fact that we can only track trauma is killing human beings, their brain, their mind, their bodies, in my world. So now I want to say that. And then I want to say, by the way, I'm looking, I'm on the side of my screen, which if you wonder where my eyes are going, so I can read a poem on the right side of my screen. But the part you said that I want to bring up, and the people centricity of it, is who we are to each other. And in the same recording I did with this beautiful man, where he was sharing about his journey into, wow, whatever I was hanging on to, it was worth it, even through all the rapids and even through all the pain and all the trauma. He was talking about his daughter and how there was something she needed to know. And I said, maybe not. Maybe we just need to hold her. And maybe she'll learn to know in her own way, not our way. So on that note, I got given an amulet yesterday, which I brought with me. And the amulet has meaning. It's a shaman that gave it to me, shaman of what he calls the one tribe people, Blue Wolf. And he and I are very synced in our consciousness, you might say, because we're paying attention to the one tribe people that all are very diverse and very separate and very individualized, but there's this familiarity in the air. And although the eyes see differently, because the interesting thing about the eyes being developed early is we talk about the third eye all the time. And that is our eyes. You know, the eyes have more capacity for sight than any other instrument in our body. We can actually see alternative worlds. And we can actually the eyes can actually go into another realm. And, but what you said, I think this was my birthday present, but these two people would never give me a birthday present, wasn't for the whole world. They just would not consider it. In the attic of my life, full of cloudy dreams, unreal, full of tastes no tongue can know and no eyes can see, when there was no ear to hear, you sang to me. I have spent my life seeking all that's still unsung, bent my ear to hear the tune and closed my eyes to see. When there were no strings to play, you played to me. In the book of love's own dream, where all the print is blood, where all the pages are my days, and all my lights grow old, when I had no wings to fly, you flew to me. You flew to me. In the secret space of dreams where I dreaming lay amazed, when the secrets all are told and the petals all unfold, when there was no dream of mine, you dreamed of me. And the question you asked me was why I do create a world, is because here we can talk about what's possible now in a human being to restore their original nature, their original design, and be trauma-free and be traumatized from time to time. But the system has a recovery. You talk about co-regulate, I think was the word. There's also trauma recovery, which mostly people think is psychological. And but trauma recovery means the ability to experience outside trauma and have trauma be a small part of our life, not the major part of our life. And who am I? I hold a field. I hold the water we're going to swim in. But that water is not me. And so create a world is like where we come to swim in the water. And so all our words are there for others. And yet in our conversations with each other, we're also there for ourselves. Because when you get to a certain level of restoration of consciousness, you're no longer insular all the time. In ways, you're more insular than ever because you're really tending to the self. I have a shaman in Australia. She won't be in the public at all, but she works with me because she has to have a place to mirror a neuron. And you all can look that up on Google too. And she can no longer be isolated just with her gods and her land and the powers and forces are ripping her island apart. She has to have someone to mirror a neuron with. So there's a deep sacredness in, I love what you said about brain spotting. I love it. I love what you said about that other thing where you shift the eyes around, because that's the same way we lift weights to get muscles. We don't think getting muscles is the end all. We just know it restores our system. And those are two things that clearly will restore the system. Clearly. Like I can't meditate with my eyes closed. I have to meditate soft eyes and have my eyes fan out to the diffused nature of the physical world. I also, when I train people in psychic ability, how I got trained is I have to have huge peripheral vision. In other words, I have to be able to see this way and I have to be able to see that way. I have to, because then I can relate what I'm seeing here with the larger framework of consciousness that lives in the peripheral state of consciousness. So even without us, my point is, even without us realizing, we're restoring our psyche, the mind of our soul, in modern terms. And I got to say, that's kick butt exciting for me. Pretty exciting. I don't care what you call it. I said to somebody once, I don't care how you get saved, pet a dog. I don't care. Just get saved. Then you're happy. And then you're working on things that are there to be worked on and not always in recovery. So that's my piece of the puzzle here. And either you or Daniela or you, Heather, anything.
I want to hear Daniela.
I wanted to hear you.
That's really the truth.
In the poem you were reading and in what you're saying, it feels like as we feel restored and more spiritually hydrated, that it has this sense, and I'm still not really there yet because my nervous system is still running very much on trauma-oriented patterns, partly from mothering in a all of us are, if we're parents, we're mothering in a culture that's not, most of us are mothering in a culture that's a little bit hard and lonely and not necessarily with all the supports that we might need. So I'm noticing how much my system is still oriented in that way. But when I listen to you, it feels like such deep rest and nourishment. And it's this feeling of when we can fall back into a feather bed of goodness that is kind of this more collectively held field. It's like that seems to be what also helps with the loneliness, because then we're not, and with the striving and with the ego and all the things that we tend to think we're supposed to be doing in order to be a good this or a good that, or that we should or shouldn't, or all this to be a good person. There's a sense of being able to just relax and rest and breathe easier. So I don't know, Tantra, if you're open to talking about it more right now, and Heather, you too, with what you've been thinking about these days, but I guess, and I haven't done the exercises yet since I just met you, and I'm so new to all of this, and I'm so excited to get to have been able to be introduced to you by Heather. Thank you, Heather. What is that? How are we doing that shift? I know we're all doing it differently, but what can we do? Maybe the exercises that you have available, what else can we all be practicing to help create that return, that rehydration, that remembrance of, yeah, sure, traumas are going to happen, things are going to happen, life's messy, but then where it doesn't cut so deep and then attach onto all these other sticky structures that our thought patterns or personalities might be orienting around. As we clear all of that out, clear it out, and feel more restored, what are the ways to just keep hydrating that for ourselves and other people?
I love the question, and the answer is I don't know.
Mhm.
Created the World was put together almost a year ago, and I dropped it, maybe to almost two, because I didn't want it to be like these models of the answer and what to do. I couldn't have it be that way. And then I had a 4-minute conversation with someone that said we're in a cultural response to me, that maybe we have two things to pay attention to. One is ourselves and getting to the truth of ourselves for ourselves. And the other is, what is our culture? And I don't mean what is our culture, white or black or United States. I mean, what is our culture? My restoration came from recognizing that I live in a shamanic mind. I live in a mystical culture of consciousness. So what's the culture of our consciousness? So your question comes from what do we restore? My answer comes from how do we discover what we be? And that's the personal observer. Because what we are today, the three of us, is we're three personal observers. That's what we are. And we're sharing what we've observed. And there's no way somebody's mind is not stimulated on this call. There's no way. And they're probably relaxing because it's not all about what to do and how to fix it and how to get there. It's more about this is what I've noticed. This is what I find myself tracking. And bless you, Daniela. And we could answer you. I could answer you easily. There's no doubt you have the level of trauma response you have. I was psychotic, diagnosed psychotic, multiple personality, borderline schizophrenic. How's that for a diagnosis? Oh yeah, mustn't forget hallucinator. No, the one where you get really hysterical. I was a hysteric. Those are my 3 diagnoses. By the way, I don't think they've changed. It's just that in my culture of consciousness, they're not that.
And they're no problem. There's no problem. Yeah.
And they're very effective for things that other people don't know how to be effective about. So what he said was, it's our culture of consciousness. And there are different cultures of consciousness that we're nourished by and fed by, and we become enlivened by. Not people, the consciousness that the people are aware of, that they're present to, that they're moving in. And we're in formation. We aren't there yet. We are in what Catholicism, what mystical Catholicism would call limbo. So I think the answer is take your best shot. Do what calls to you. See how it makes you feel. If it's life enhancing, follow the thread. It's life depleting, get the hell out of there. That would be my 2 comments. There was one other thing I want to say before I turn it over to the 2 of you. And it's just amazing, Daniela, to watch you work. You do brain spot naturally, because I could feel a ripple in the field, and then it reset itself. Pretty cool. I just want to comment, pretty cool. And because that's what I pay attention to. I'm more like the Jedi Knights. There's a ripple in the force kind of thing. And how do you reset so there's no more ripple in the force? And to accept that your son and you, and I'm only saying it this way, is that maybe we need to reset our consciousness. If we were in a concentration camp, we would have no problem with, we were going to have to survive, and we're going to have to find a way to stay related. And we're going to have to find a way, like a doctor who came over here, Dr. Zed, who could never practice over here because he couldn't get English. He couldn't, major surgeon, had to do those horrible things in those concentration camps. And he informed his wife and his 2 kids, because the promise was they would stay together. They made figures out of dirt. They made play toys out of broken things on the floor. They played all day long. All day long. And Zaria, who was my friend, she was trauma-free. She was trauma-free. And he was doing hideous things for the Nazis while he kept his family instructed in a bubble of, we may look like we're there, but we're not really. I think those kind of applications of thought at this time, since we constantly look to the world for how things are going, I think we're kind of in a concentration camp. And terrible things are happening. one of my people was a major player in a war. In fact, he was instrumental, led the battle. And because he was good at it. And now all I'm doing is he and I are working on who is he now? He's not that anymore. He doesn't have to be there anymore. He doesn't have to play there anymore. And I think that we keep trying to be somewhere where there's no trauma. Well, we're swimming in it. But how do we make our bubble? And this is a bubble where we play. And we hope, we pray with our hearts, don't we, that everybody's better off for the chat? Because we can't reach every, say, I'm going to sob again. Because if I could do 1 million people in a day, I would. So would all of us that care. But I can't. So we just keep making threads, each of us in our own way, threads out. Because when I was 16, when I got God, way back then, the voice said to me, take good care of my people. You need touch only one, and you will never know which one. And I think that's our kind of our new mantra of care. Self-care is not hiding from the world unless you need to. Self-care is taking care of the self in all of us so that it can rise. So that's my response.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you. And Heather, anything for you? She's note-taking.
Yes. Well, I just think doing it in community and family is so important. And that idea of cultures of care and cultures of consciousness. And that with the internet now, there really are ways to connect, even if you don't have it in person. And that makes me really excited. And even in a family, Daniela, my kids are a wee bit older than yours. My oldest is 13 now. And what I really noticed as my kids got older is I went from holding that bubble for them so much. But then now it's like we're all teammates and doing it together. So it's like so I feel like I wrote this thing on my blog called Parenting Alongside. I went from literally holding it to now it's like I literally feel my kids alongside of me and we're a force working together. And so, it's hard to remember that when you're mothering young children or when you're starting in communities or when we're starting in our careers but ultimately, I think when we're following what's nurturing life and what's life enhancing, and we're really informing each other as well and being transparent and vulnerable and also empowering with the people in our lives, then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, my team is right here. And when I have people come in with patients, I always ask, like, who's on your healing team? And we just don't think about that because we really have been kind of trained that we're islands. But even if it's just a few people that we really trust that can be on our team, it makes such a huge difference.
I love, so my kids are older than both yours. Yeah. But I love this. This is kind of like the perfect way to complete. Because I have a 40-year-old, I have a 56-year-old, a 40-year-old, and a 38-year-old right now. And because they're usually a year apart, but right now they're a year and a half. And what's so fascinating to me is they were born one of them was born and I had to give away because my mother went after raising him and she was a violent alcoholic and I couldn't live with that. And she got custody of him. So I gave him away before she could get him. And he's back in my life. And my other two children were raised in a woman who had a mission, and she was rarely there. And one time I asked them, were they okay about it? They were 9 and 11. And they said, Mom, we knew that. We knew we were going to have to take care of ourselves when we got here. But now here, I'm 76 and they're in their ages, we're now cleaning up the trauma that happened to them when they were young, that they basically stuffed to have a life and to give me space to be who I was. So it isn't like there's one answer to all these questions. It's more like where to go to work. So if you're so personally traumatized you can't move, find somebody to get you moving.
Mhm.
If the world around you is killing you inside and out, find a group to protect you, to culture, not only protect you from or like defend, not like we have this horror of the enemy. I don't have the enemy. There's no enemy in paradise. There's just discernment and choice. But find a world that you can culture in while you heal. If you find the surges, which I think is happening to a lot of people, where you're beginning to connect into the larger consciousness of creation, probably find somebody like me or people that like gurus, so that you can understand that a cortisol surge may be the spirit of the Lord moving through you, it may be the greater realms of consciousness opening you up to brighter, more extraordinary realms of activity, of being, which, Heather can track a bit with me, because she went through that. And then if you find yourself above it all and starting to be on a track of something totally different, you may still have to clean up your relationship with your children, your spouse. There may be things to do in paradise. And so that paradise is clean and beautiful, and no longer having to carry certain things that it has had to carry up until now. So thank you both with all my heart. I'd like to do this again. I felt, Daniela, that I needed to set the stage, not only given who you are and Heather as I am, as beingnesses, I needed to set the stage for the next 2 months. But I would more than love to have us come back again now that I've set the stage, and people have more awareness of this sort of attention we're paying attention to, Have a blessed day, as the man would say that did the recording with me. Take care.
Thank you.